Good evening. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming out. You're in store for a great, great evening. Our guests tonight really need no introduction. After all, they know each other. But for all of you who might be unfamiliar with the extent of their literary accomplishments, let me give you a quick review. I say quick because with stars of this magnitude, I feel a little bit like the bellhop at the honeymoon hotel. No matter how well I do my job, you can't wait for me to finish. So I'm going to be quick. In introducing these luminaries of American literature, it's key to say that they are best-selling authors. Their writing is challenging, provocative, important to help us understand ourselves, as well as to help us understand our times. Yet their work is accessible, incredibly so. You may have met writers who've published books that were not met with success in the marketplace, and those authors often take comfort in saying, well, at least it wasn't some trashy bestseller. Well, they can't say that to our guests tonight. Our authors write bestsellers that are elevating, inspiring, that penetrate the human soul. Their books are classics that will be read for the rest of this new century, and I believe into the next century. These are books that are going to be classics. Let me begin by introducing to you Toni Morrison, who turned 70 in February. Toni Morrison is the 1993 Nobel Prize winner for literature. She's a 1988 Pulitzer Prize winner as well. She's a professor of literature at Princeton University and the author of a trilogy, a well-known trilogy, that began with the book Beloved in 1987. It was followed by the book Jazz in 1992 and completed with the work Paradise in 1998. She's also written Tar Baby and Song of Solomon. In 1992, to pick up on the bestseller theme, Toni Morrison had two books on the New York Times bestseller list simultaneously: Jazz, a work of fiction, and Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, a work of nonfiction. Her first book, published in 1970, was The Bluest Eye, the story of a black girl who dreams of changing the color of her eyes. Toni Morrison didn't begin writing, though, until she was into her 30s. Born in Lorain, Ohio, to Ramah and George Wofford, a stay-at-home mom and a ship welder, her parents christened her Chloe Wofford. Chloe did her undergraduate work at Howard University, where she picked up the nickname Toni. After Howard, she got her master's in English literature from Cornell. That led to a career as an editor at Random House, which is an important part of her story because Toni Morrison is a force in American literature as a mentor, editor, and friend to a range of writers. Her last name, Morrison, comes from a marriage that produced two sons. I'm emphasizing how Chloe Wofford became Toni Morrison because Miss Morrison once told the New York Times that she achieved fame under the wrong name. She said that the person who went to Stockholm to get the Nobel Prize was Chloe Wofford. So please welcome a literary genius by any name, Toni Morrison. We're also fortunate tonight to be joined by Frank McCourt. Frank is also 70. He turned 70 last August, and he told me backstage that, in fact, he shares the same birthday as Bill Clinton and Tipper Gore. Make of that what you will. I thought he was like, first he told me about Bill Clinton, then he said almost as a leavening fact, also Tipper Gore, so we don't know. Frank, our other literary luminary, is the author, and again, I don't know why I need to tell you this, but in case you missed it, the author of Angela's Ashes, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book that sold 4 million copies while appearing on the New York Times bestseller list for 117 weeks. The memoir was published in 1996, and in the year 2000 was made into a movie. The book is the story of growing up in a poverty-stricken Irish home with a strong, although long-suffering mother, and an alcoholic dad who was largely absent. Frank McCourt's second book, Tis, published in 1999, is a sequel to Angela's Ashes. It picks up with the 19-year-old Frank McCourt sailing to America, full of hope, looking for a new life. Frank McCourt was born in Brooklyn, New York, but moved back to Ireland with his family at the age of 4. Angela's Ashes is notable for its open, almost excruciatingly honest telling of family life, including family tragedies such as the death of infants. But it's done with such great energy and love, such a sense of redemption and humor about every event, that it is truly a book to savor, a book to treasure. Frank McCourt is a graduate of New York University. He taught in the New York City public schools for 30 years. In fact, he didn't write Angela's Ashes until after his retirement from teaching. Frank has just returned from a trip to Ireland, so please join me in welcoming another literary genius, Frank McCourt. Well, we're so fortunate to have the two of you with us, and as you can tell by the applause and by the energy in this audience, people want to know what you two are like as human beings, in a way to go beyond your writing, to go beyond the books. And I wanted to start by saying and setting the scene that really, you two write about vulnerable groups. When I think about Toni Morrison's books, I think of the Black experience, but I also think especially of Black women and the lives of Black women, and maybe even as a subset of Black women, Black female children as a vulnerable group in the society. And Frank, when I read your work, I think again of a vulnerable group. I think of immigrants, and I think in specific of your life as a vulnerable child growing up in a household where there were many pressures on you, pressures that could have been too much for a child to bear. So here we have, in the two of you, two perspectives on being human, two perspectives on being vulnerable, even two perspectives on being American. So I wanted to start by throwing out the question, who do you write for? Who's in your head when you're writing these books? Who are you telling these stories to? Toni?
Well, I am telling the stories to the people in the book. I'm very specifically concerned whether or not the little girl in the bluest eye, or those friends of hers, or any of them, those people, if they were standing behind me reading the book, would they agree? Would it satisfy them? It was a choice that was very deliberate, because what I was feeling, probably less than the vulnerable quality of the characters, was the fact that they didn't exist in literature at all. There was no place you could find that voice. So it was important that the voice be authentic, that I'm able to bring some authenticity to it. So it was always an effort on my part to make sure, to sort of realize, imagine and realize those people, and then ask them to come in and listen to the story that I am writing about them and verify it. And when I'm in trouble, and sometimes, I was in trouble in terms of the writing, that was the place I would always have to go.
You go back to the characters.
Always, yeah. I didn't trust other readers to know. I didn't trust my own self in the beginning, because there was things I would write that were just beautiful, and I would be overwhelmed with the beauty of it, and it would be useless. And I didn't, trust the publishing industry. I didn't trust the media. I didn't trust the press. I didn't trust the critics. Obviously, I didn't trust anybody, because no one had written that story. There was no place for it in literature. So where do I go for that feeling of trust? And that would be with the characters. That started out because I couldn't answer the question, to whom am I writing? It became a habit with the subsequent books, even after I had a fairly substantial readership and serious critical attention. I still relied on the accuracy of a Setha or somebody to tell me, yes, this is the way it was.
Frank, who are you writing for?
I think that the years I spent in the classroom in New York City did something to me, for me. Talking to American teenagers, 5 classes a day, 5 days a week, and trying to hold their attention. There's nothing like it in the world. People are always saying to me, don't you get nervous when you come out there with these talks? No. No, I mean, not after the American adolescence. I think I could be quite easy before the Spanish Inquisition after. And I think I wasn't a particularly extroverted person or personable or gregarious, but I got this teaching job, and I had to go in and I had to do something, and you stand before them, and they're not your natural friends. You're almost enemy. You're the man. You represent all the power and the glory and so. So I had to hook them somehow, and I developed. I think they forced me. They forced me into simplicity. You strip your language of all adornment, because you can't be literary or anything like that. What are you talking about? Yeah, what? And you have to be, you have to speak simply, and you have to speak with honesty. That's the main thing, is what I was saying earlier at dinner time. That even though they lie, but they want the truth from the teacher. And I think 30 years of doing this, and my own, talking to them about writing. I was trying to write. You can't when you're teaching 5 classes a day. Talking to them about writing, reading writers, reading a whole range of writers, American and European, and talking about simplicity again, which they didn't know. They didn't trust this. Or they thought you had to use all kinds of adornments and so on. So I think I would try to get them to write simply. And by talking to them all the time, I was talking to myself. So eventually, when I wrote Angela's Ashes, I don't think I had an audience in mind at all. I was talking to myself. And with the result, and since I'm very simple, I had to write to myself in a very simple way and keep it clear. And I use the voice. That's how I use the voice and perspective of a child. And sometimes, and then I had this uneasy feeling, maybe I'm just being too naive and so on, but that's the way it was coming out, and I was satisfied with it. You know when you've been true. You know when you're sitting there and you create an honest sentence, or you know then, and it doesn't matter what the audience is.
Tony's nodding. You know it, Toni?
No, I don't always know it. I know when I produce honest. You have to understand that there's some enormous difference between his project and mine. His is memoir. It has imaginative feats, and it has eloquence, and it's not as simple as you think, Frank. That's hard, writing simple, powerful sentences. But it's based on memory, whereas what I write is whole cloth. I invent characters completely, and they're not based on anybody. The first book I wrote had some, basis, because the first novel, you're always sort of scared you better rely, hook onto something real. But that's the excitement for me, is to invent a world, or even take a historical character and reinvent that person and redo their life for me. So that truth for me is a little bit different. It's not the same thing as honesty. It is about something that lies underneath facts, because I'm trying to get into a reader's mind in a lot of ways. There's always a text underneath the text. There's a palette. There's a color. There are all these other things I want the reader engaged in all these ways and all these levels. And ambiguity is as important to me as the truth. A restless, animate ending where the reader does as much work as I do in trying to grasp what is important. So there is no final turn off the television into it. So the enterprises are quite different. But on the other hand, the satisfaction comes in getting as close to the truly memorable and at the same time provocative image, so that the reader feels comfortable in the company of those characters.
Now, I was thinking to myself as I was listening to you talk, and you're saying you're getting below fact. You're getting below sort of memory even, and you're inviting the reader to grapple. Both of you, nonetheless, are quite revealing about what goes on in human experience. Very revealing. Frank, I think you call it the excitement. And I'm thinking to myself,
That's getting below the level.
that's it. And I'm thinking to myself, there are people, in the case of the memoir, who criticize you for it. And in fact, fellow Irishmen who say, Frank, how could you? There's nothing lower than what you've done here. Do you feel bad about it?
No, I don't, because I don't want to put myself into exalted company. But this is the what they call begrudgery in Ireland. You raise your head above the ground, boom, they shoot you down. Practically everybody, if you write any kind of a novel, particularly Joyce was vilified and castigated, and he was never banned. Nobody could read him anyway, so he was safe. But other writers, there was a man named Brinsley McNamara in 1919 who wrote a novel called Valley of the Squinting Windows about his village, and he told the truth about he was driven out of the village. A man named John McGahern, wrote a book called The Dark. He was driven out of his village. So and various writers, Edna O'Brien, who's still with us, she was vilified and banned. So they had a strong censorship in Ireland they still have it, but nobody pays any attention to it anymore. But I think in a very deep way, Toni and I share something that I've often thought about, the fact that English is not our native language. because her genes call back to Africa, and mine call back to an older Gaelic tradition. And we take a language that we grew up with, yeah. But I think we have rhythms and a sensitivity or a sensibility about the English language that Anglo-Saxon writers don't have. So, but I know I have, having grown up in Ireland and reading Irish literature constantly, there are rhythms in the language that you don't find in the English novel, say, or the American novel. And this was power. We didn't study poetry in school. We had it at home. We sang Irish. We have a culture. We have a music, and we'd sit around the fire in the evening. There was no television, no radio, so we'd sing endless, one song after another. And that's what makes me sad about the kids nowadays. There's no common tradition. The only song I could get my high school seniors to sing once in a bus was "We All Live in a Yellow Submarine." So I think when you talk about going deep, I don't know. I'm treading on foreign territory when I talk about the African American experience, because I don't know what calls to the African American soul, but I know what calls to the Irish American soul when I hear these rhythms, when I hear the music.
Is that right, Toni, that the language that you're using, you think maybe picking up on what Frank said, is coming from a different place than Anglo writers would use, that it comes out, Frank talks about the Irish rhythms. Are there African American rhythms that you think are reflected in your work?
Well, there's a very specific vernacular that is African American. Street language, it is called in some places country language, regional language, but there is a certain kind of language that I can speak to an African American anywhere. But there is also, and it was very much in my family, two other things, which was biblical reading and sermons. The very devout people. There was also an absolute, they were always in awe of reading. My grandfather could not attend school. He went one day in order to announce that he couldn't come back, but his accomplishment was having read the Bible through 3 times. So that it was a very important thing with limited libraries. But so, in other words, that they understood and appreciated and relished standard English, as well as lyrical language, as well as street languages, and so on. So in my books, I always went up and down that scale to recreate a third kind of English that took into consideration all these varieties that were available to me. But the other thing was the singing, was the music, was being, at that time, everybody sang up and down the street, on the porch. I mean, it wasn't performance, it was just conversation, or what people did. About 10 years ago, I was in where I live in Rockland County, and I heard a man singing, and I looked out the window, and there was a black postman who was delivering mail and singing at the top of his voice in the most beautiful voice I had heard in a long time. And I started to grin, and because, milkmen used to sing, Iceman would come, and they would be singing. And I thought, oh my God, do you know that in 7 days, someone had complained about him?
Oh, gosh.
And he felt like, first he was told, and then he was, moved, because he was singing, waking up everybody. I don't know what he was doing. It was just amazing. But it was that kind of constant sound of uncles and aunts and us, and also we were asked to participate in that. So that when I'm writing, I guess I have this ear, you hear this rhythm, this emphasis. And one other thing is that when you sing a song, when a song is being sung, it changes very subtly, depending on the singer. And you could hear it from one singer and hear it in another. Same song, same notes, same words, but it's a different song. And you hear a record over and over again, and then later on it means something different to you. That quality was very much a part of my fictional writing, is to have the language, I guess you could call it double entendre, but it has an echo, it means something else when heard by another person, etc. And that's part of what lies underneath the narrative, what lies underneath the plot, is this loam. I try to plumb this layer of other kinds of information and, aesthetic or rich responses.
Now, I just wanted to come back to a question that I had posed to Frank with you, Toni, which was about telling secrets, because one of the secrets that I think lots of people in the African American community feel is revealed in your work is about relationships between black men and black women, and they worry about how those relationships are portrayed, especially black men. So, how do you feel about that?
Well, that question is about how black people are perceived elsewhere.
Right.
It's about what will they think of us if we A, B, or C. That is such a censorship, such a self-censorship, that I just couldn't deal with it instantly. And I always knew that I was not going to write keep your best foot forward kind of fake fiction. I felt it was too important. I knew I could not dupe black readers. I thought they would catch me out if I faked it. On the other hand, when they thought about them reading it, they would be perhaps embarrassed or, wonder. Early on in my career, I remember a young woman in California respond. This is before I'd written the second book. I'd only written The Bluest Eye. And she said, "I liked your book very much, and I really love you for writing it, and I also really hate you for writing it because I didn't want them to know." So it was like a public relations effort, right, and always being sort of under the white gaze. And that gaze was so debilitating, so hurtful, so it fructified everything. It just, it was either excessive superstardom or something else. It was just a burden. So I determined to write outside that gaze, and that there would be no, token white vision in the book at all. And also, I had always felt in some of the writers who are African American that I liked a lot, that there was always this voice that was not talking to me. It was talking to somebody else over my shoulder.
So they were writing for whites?
In many instances. They were explaining things to people. They didn't have to explain it to me. You know what I mean? I don't mean completely, and I certainly don't mean totally, but I think it's not because I'm a writer or even a reader, because I'm an editor, and I can feel that voice when it's being addressed outside rather than within. And that gave it a kind of awkwardness, because you can't, I suppose it exists in other cultures, but, you don't feel that, maybe some Russian writers are writing for the French. Maybe some French people are writing for the English. You know what I'm trying to say? But what has that got to do with anything? So I just determined to stake my claim right there and not at all respond to this overwhelming perception of a non-black or a white gaze that was going to judge, respond to, and evaluate everything that I wrote.
Now, Frank, I heard a story, and you're going to have to tell me if it's true or not, where you're on stage with your brother and you're putting on an act, a play about your life, and your mother is in the audience, and she stands up and starts shouting, "That's not what happened, that's not the way it happened."
Well, this was a show we concocted, an autobiographical show called A Couple of Blackguards, and we put on in New York in the late 70s, and my mother came, and she sat in the audience, and we were talking about growing up in Ireland, you know, the stuff that's in Angel's Ashes, and his adventures in America and my adventures in America. But halfway through the first act, she stood up in the audience and she says, "'Twasn't that way at all, it's all a pack of lies." And we said, "Well, why don't you come up and give us your version?" And she says, "I wouldn't be caught dead up there with the two of you, I have a reputation." So she was, this is the typical Irish mother trying to make successes out of her sons. But when I was writing Angel's Ashes, I thought, well, here it's a mild story about growing up in the slum in Limerick, and I thought it would be. I was surprised when anybody published it. Somebody told me, well, this book will appeal to middle-aged Irish women disappointed in life. The strongest criticism came in Ireland, particularly among the intellectuals. There was something that got to them, and they went after me, and it's even been discussed in academic conferences, and I've been vilified. There's one professor in Connecticut told me about this, but for some reason it got under their skin, and I think one of the things about it, they haven't been able to categorize me. Is he Irish? Is he Irish American? What the hell is he? Where do we put him? When it comes to anthologizing, what do we do with him? The English claim T.S. Eliot, and they've claimed Henry James, and the Americans claim T.S. Eliot. So it's no wonder the man died miserably. And the thing is, of course, Toni knows more about this than I do. She's been at it much longer. You have an experience like this, and you have to deal with. You write a book, and boom, it gets on the bestseller list, and people start people have attacked me, walked up to me, and nobody has mauled me or anything like that, but they've walked up and yelled at me, and so recently I was doing a talk somewhere, and somebody in the audience asked me about Catholicism. I said, well, they said, "What's your relationship with the Catholic Church?" And I said, "I've forgiven them."
That was terrific.
So you don't know when you write a book that you're going to go on and do. I could retire like J.D. Salinger or Philip Roth and just disappear. But this is a new experience for me at this stage of my life, so welcome controversy.
So, Toni, when you hear about people coming up and attacking you, do people ever come up to you and say, "Toni, I'm mad at you, I just can't"?
Not anymore.
They've given
now,
up?
Now I usually don't hear from people who really despise me or my work. But in the beginning, I was a lot. Politically, I was criticized because I did not follow, and this was in sort of Black studies areas as well as in the press, because the Bluest Eye and Sula also was understood to be not supportive of Black male self-love, and also it was understood to be revealing a certain aspect of African American life that was secret or not to be revealed. So the early responses were vile.
You got bad reviews?
Oh, yeah.
Huh?
Oh, lots. No one remembers but me. I remember them all. Everyone. As a matter of fact, the Bluest Eye got one good review from John Leonard, and all of the rest were dismissive and unkind. And there were people in areas that Song of Solomon, as late as Song of Solomon, there were schools, black schools, that banned that book. Banned it. It was not to be sold on the campus and in the bookstores, and never appeared in the library at all. The same thing was true of The Bluest Eye, which somehow was about incest, and therefore was banned, and gave a bad name or to the African American communities, and it was wiped from the courses in which other books were being taught. So, mind you, the book was published in 1970, so you can imagine that in the late 60s there was a great deal of anxiety about what was taught and who could teach it, etc. And the books that I wrote were, the only way that The Bluest Eye, which sold, 1,500 copies, its first run, after about 2 years, I'll have you know. But the only reason it survived was because, and this is the only reason, is because the teachers at City College and Hunter College made it required reading for the women in those schools. And suddenly the paperback house had these orders, huge orders, for this book. So they kept it alive in the paperback. So it always had a life. It began to have a life in the academy before it had a life out in the street, so to speak. It was really quite reversed. But now, I think people think because in the last 4 or 5 years, or maybe longer, maybe 6 or 7 years, I had some accolades for my work. As you said, this is 2001. This all started in the late 60s. So I began with this, real feeling of betrayal in a sense. But it just made me clearer about the mission. But there was no encouragement from most of the people that I really wanted encouragement from.
That's amazing to hear, because I view you as such a loved and honored figure, but you forget the struggle, right? Right. Frank, I just wanted to jump now to the idea of the other in both of your works. And in your case, in Angela's Ashes, is your father the other? Is he whom you are playing against, or is it poverty? Is poverty the other? Is it the idea that you might die in these circumstances, that you might not be able to tolerate it, not only in terms of dealing with hunger, but dealing with just the emotional baggage of this horrible situation? Is that the other? Is that where the tension comes?
Well, there was, we were accustomed to death, and we didn't have any euphemisms. You died, you didn't pass away. You weren't taken to the bosom of the Lord, you died. And going to funerals was a pastime. It was, because you'd go around the neighborhood and you'd see wreaths on the doors with little cards with purple borders announcing that somebody had died. And then when you were a kid, you would knock on the door, and it was considered very wise to have children come in and pray for the dead. And the dead were at home. There were no funeral homes. And they had flowers in the room and candles to kill the smell of decomposition. It was very exciting, because, and you would be brought in then to pray, and then you would be given lemonade or something like that. And that night there was a party, you go to the party. So then we would go to the funeral, because we'd march behind the hearse, horse-drawn hearse. We belonged to the Death of the Month Club. There were so many. So there was that. That was the. I don't know if it was frightening, but three children in my family died, the twins and the little girl. All around me, people were keeling over. My father was an alcoholic, but I think the major thing in it, with all of this, it's hard enough to deal with poverty and what poverty does. It damages you. It destroys your self-esteem. You never have any. Nobody walks tall out of a slum. You have no pride at all. You're barely hanging on. But what compounded it was the church, because it's very hard, and various Irish writers have tried to do it, convey the power of the Catholic Church, because they get you early. The Jesuits say, give us a boy till he's 7, and he's ours forever. So they get you early, and they imbue in you a sense. It's a very powerful organization. It's brilliant psychology. Imbue in you a sense of sin, and they give you a list of sins: the 7 deadly sins, the 10 commandments, and so on, and sins in Ireland that were never heard of anywhere else. Or particular sins. So you're living in this town. And there's Mass, and if you miss Mass on a Sunday, it's a mortal sin. And if you commit a mortal sin and you die, you go to hell. Hell, hell. And we were little kids, and this was pounded into us, and they were very eloquent about this. The priest really blossomed when they would start preaching about the horrors of hell. They were pretty weak on heaven, but powerful about hell. So we were exposed to all of this, and in addition to the poverty and the lack or loss of self-esteem, if we ever had it, we had to deal with the hereafter. If you had removed the hereafter, we might have become thieves or something like that. But there was always this threat. Well, we did steal. But the more I look back at it, the more I'm appalled at the power of the church. And it's beginning to crumble now in Ireland. But my father was, he wasn't the other, he was an archetype of an Irish drunken father. And that's a standard figure in Irish literature too. Like the disappeared father in African American, or the vagabond father. That was, my father fit into a pattern more, because it was a defeated society, where it was very hard to find work, and they were defeated. So these were the ingredients: the poverty and the Catholic Church and the alcoholic father. But the other ingredient, the positive ingredient, was the dream of getting out.
And when in the second book, in Tis,
Yeah.
the other strikes me as being sort of the Ivy League, upper-class Anglo-white kids in America.
Yeah.
And you're cleaning up after those kids,
Yeah.
taking some of their drinks after they have half finished them.
Yeah, there are probably people sitting in this audience who were college kids sitting in the Biltmore Hotel when I was cleaning up. And that didn't do, because even though I lacked self-esteem, I knew I was better than that. I was a reader. I was in the public library all the time in Limerick, reading whatever I could get my hands on. And I knew I was capable. The funny thing is that when I came to New York, I suppose I moved into an Irish-American community. The Irish-Americans saw me as somebody who just stopped off the boat, and they thought I was only capable of cleaning up. They wouldn't even think of that I might be able to sit behind a desk and move papers around. So I got these menial. That was their conception or misconception of the Irish from Ireland. We were a simple people off the farms. Oh, well, he barely knew. Well, they were right. I barely knew how to use a knife and fork. But I also knew how to read and write. But this was their stereotype of their own people.
So the other was not only the Anglos, but it was Irish who'd been here longer than you.
Yeah. They were the others. There were all kinds of others
Right.
when you get off the boat. Sometimes when I was teaching, I had to work this out for myself in all those years of teaching, and I had all kinds of kids in my classes: Chinese kids, Koreans, black kids, and so on, Italians. And I was led into this. They would talk about it, and I'd say, I said to him, I said, we talk, well, what do you feel like? And I tell you, I said, Joy, the Italian kid, if I woke you up in the middle of the night and said, what are you? What would you say? He said, tired. And the one I think a lot about George Plimpton for some reason. Because what does he think about? He has no hyphen. So what the hell goes on in his mind? You see those wasps wandering around in you, and you admire them, you envy them on one hand, but you say, what are they going to write about? Space.
Space, that's next. Toni, when you were talking earlier, I was thinking to myself, you said, there'd never been this voice in literature. This story had never been told. And I was thinking, well, she's not only talking about the black-white experience, but it's also very female. And I was thinking to myself, so I guess the ultimate other in a Toni Morrison book would be a white man.
Yeah.
That's right?
It's interesting you said that because I was trying to explain to somebody what they said, what do you think makes black American women's fiction different from anything else? We had narrowed it down. And I said, everybody writes about white men. White men write about white men because that's what's interesting to them. And that's who they are. And white women write about white men because that's their fathers, their sons, their lovers, their brothers, and it's inevitable and natural that they should. And black men write about white men because he's the man, the enemy, the one you have to confront or something, deal with, triumph over, or blame. And the only people I knew who didn't write about white men were black women because they were of no interest to them. As a general group. They were sort of like out there, but their real interest was other women, their own men, and their children. So that most of the literature, which I'm sure has changed by now, has excluded white males as major characters and also as the gays. I can't tell you, as a person who, I don't even remember my life before I could read, as a reader, as an early reader, what it does to the imagination when you get rid of them. When you take out what I take out, the white male, just like this whole world just jumps up. And you can talk about anything now. You can say anything, you can imagine everything, because there's not this other thing over there occupying all this space.
Speaking of space again.
Sure.
So Frank doesn't fit? Frank doesn't have any place in Toni Morrison's world?
No, that's not true. Frank, listen, Aeschylus, Frank McCourt, Shakespeare, James Joyce, the whole kit. Those are the writers I love. Those are the writers I still read. I'm not talking about having a place in my education or in my mind as far as what I love. I'm talking about inventing the world. If you can invent the world for the purposes of a novel, the moment you have a white male character in it, he eats it up. He's like, yeah, what are you gonna do about him? What does he think? Who's does he belong to? Who are his? But take him out. And then you have this other world of other people and fresh insights into even him, even that. But, it just opens it up. It's a present that exists because that's the way we were acculturated, that's the way we were educated, that's who runs the world, that's who calls the shots, that's who makes the money. Particularly for somebody in my generation, that was it. Whether he was a good guy or a bad guy doesn't make any difference. But that's what it was about. I read Fitzgerald, I read Hemingway, I read Dostoevsky, but that's what they're talking about. And it was brilliant, informative, exciting, but there was no place in there for what I wanted to do. So I had to get rid of Nick.
Right.
And Thomas Sutpen. What is the world like without Thomas Sutpen in it? With just those people he left behind. That's what I mean. It's a strategy for reinventing a world that you want to occupy as a writer.
And could you ever have a white man as a lover?
Say that again. Rephrase that question. No, wait a minute, I'm trying to think. If I ever went into that territory in any book. Did I? No? No. I guess I haven't. I'll see what I can do.
All right, we'll look for that. Frank, when you are struggling in your Irish immigrant world, does Toni Morrison exist as a black woman, a smart, capable black woman, sexy black woman?
I don't live too much in the Irish immigrant world. Once I arrived in New York and spent some time working, drafted into the Army, where I was in mainstream America, all kinds, and then came out and became a teacher, again, mainstream America, where others of my generation would arrive in New York and move into the Irish ghetto and go to Irish dance halls and Irish pub. I was dealing with kids of all colors, so I was always attracted to Irish music and literature and so on. But I had to deal with American literature. I think the first novel that hit me very hard was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, because I was that kid coming up from the South. I knew how he felt when he got on the train and so on, and I thought this is my brother. So, and I've always, as a teacher with African American kids, I had to deal with them. You have to deal with them; they won't go away. And then you have to deal with the question at that time in the 60s. Remember, there was a lot of talk about black English, teaching black English in the schools. That seems to have abated now. So that I wasn't prepared. I wasn't trained to do this. So I had to make my own way. But I became aware of African American literature very early, and African literature, because I wanted to freshen myself a bit. So. We started reading Soyinka and Achebe and so on. So I didn't want to stay in the same Western rut all the time, and Irish literature was a form of Irish American history for me was a way into American history. So all of this stuff was going on, and I don't know if you never resolve anything. You just keep. What I'm trying to do right now is write a novel. Because I'm tired of myself. So I'm like creating characters out of whole cloth. But it's a novel about teaching, so therefore F. McCourt will prowl the classrooms. So this is the act of creation, which I love. But for me, it's much harder than writing the memoir. But this Irish American thing, I'm caught in it. For a while, I thought I wanted to get away from it. It must be different to be black. You're there in your skin, and there's no way out, baby. There you are. But I could change my accent. I tried at times, but I sounded. I did.
Were you successful?
I sounded like Edward G. Robinson underwater. But it didn't work. So I think, and a lot of people I know have lost their accents, teachers who came up. But I would, year after year after year after year, here I am, I'm the other to those kids. Because I have this, yo, Mr. McCourt, you Scotch or something? And then I'd have to explain that I was Irish. So it was a bridge between me and them. And I don't know if blackness or African Americanness ever acts as a bridge to the white world. That's something only you would know. But I know this Irish thing has helped me as a teacher, although many times I wanted to just shake it off and be George Plimpton.
Let me ask the indulgence of the timekeepers, because what I want the two of you to do now is to take turns and do a little bit of a reading. And if you don't mind, Frank, would you grace us for a minute or two?
This is about books. It's about a library. The first time they opened up a children's library, or a library in Limerick. There was no library for children, but there was a library for adults, and my mother used to send me to this library to get her books. I had to have a note to get in. The librarians in Ireland were different from the librarians here. The librarians in Ireland were afraid we might read a book. So I'd get a note from my mother to go and get. It's raining so hard one day. Miss O'Rear in the library says, "Don't go out in that rain or you'll ruin the books you're carrying. Sit down over there and behave yourself. You can read all about the saints while you're waiting." There are 4 big books, Butler's Lives of the Saints. I don't want to spend my life reading about saints, but when I start, I wish the rain would last forever. Whenever you see pictures of saints, men or women, they're always looking up to heaven, where there are clouds filled with little fat angels carrying flowers or harps, giving praise. My uncle, Pa Keating, says he can't think of a single saint in heaven he'd want to sit down and have a pint with. The saints in these books are different. There are stories about virgins, martyrs, virgin martyrs, and they're worse than any horror film at the Lyric Cinema. I have to look in the dictionary to find out what a virgin is. I know the mother of God is the Virgin Mary, and they call her that because she didn't have a proper husband, only poor old St. Joseph. And in the lives of the saints, the virgins are always getting into trouble, and I don't know why. The dictionary says virgin, woman, usually a young woman who is and remains in a state of inviolate chastity. Now I have to look up inviolate chastity. And all I can find here is that inviolate means not violate, and chastity means chaste, and that means pure from unlawful sexual intercourse. Now I have to look up intercourse. And that leads to copulation, the union of the sexes in the art of generation. I don't know what that means. And I'm too weary going from one word to another in this heavy dictionary, which leads me on a wild goose chase from this word to that word, and all because the people who wrote the dictionary don't want the likes of me to know anything. All I want to know is where I came from. But if you ask anyone, they tell you ask someone else or send you from word to word. All these virgin martyrs are told by the Roman judges they had to give up their faith and accept the Roman gods, but they say nay. That's how virgin martyrs talk, nay. And the judges have them tortured and killed. My favorite is St. Christina the Astonishing, who takes ages to die. The judge says, cut off her breast, and when they do, she throws it at him. And he goes deaf and blind. Another judge is brought on the case, and he says, cut off the other breast, and the same thing happens. They try to kill her with arrows, but they just bounce off her and kill the soldiers who shot them. They try to boil her in oil, but she rocks in the vat and takes a nap for herself. Then the judges get fed up and have her head cut off, and that does the job. The Feast of St. Christina the Astonishing is the 24th of July, and I think I'll keep that for myself, along with the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi, the 4th of October. The librarian says, "You have to go home now. The rain has stopped." And when I'm going out the door, she calls me back. She wants to write a note to my mother, and she doesn't mind one bit if I read it. The note says, "Dear Mrs. McCourt, just when you think Ireland has gone to the dogs altogether, you find a boy sitting in the library, so absorbed in the lives of the saints, he doesn't realize the rain has stopped. And you have to drag him away from the aforesaid lives. I think, Mrs. McCourt, you might have a future priest on your hands." And I light a candle in hopes it comes true. I remain, yours truly, Catherine O'Riordan, Assistant Librarian.
Toni Morrison, would you grace us with a reading?
Yes, I Xeroxed some pages from jazz that I thought I would read. This is the conclusion of a novel in which the narrator is unreliable and who learns along with the reader what the truth is about the characters the narrator has been half describing, half witnessing, and half inventing. And what happens ultimately in the book is that the characters are bigger than the novel, bigger than the narrator, and the narrator learns what the limits of the imagination are, and then realizes how wrong she's been about the characters. When I see them now, they're not sepia or still, losing their edges to the light of a future afternoon, caught midway between was and must be. For me, they are real, sharply in focus and clicking. I wonder, do they know they are the sound of snapping fingers under the sycamores lining the streets? When the loud trains pull into their stops and the engines pause, attentive listeners can hear it. Even when they're not there, when whole city blocks downtown and acres of lawn neighborhoods in Sag Harbor cannot see them, the clicking is there. It's in the T-strap shoes of Long Island debutantes, the sparkling fringes of daring short skirts that swish and glide to music that intoxicates them more than the champagne. It is in the eyes of the old men who watch these girls and the young ones who hold them up. It's in the graceful slouch of the men slipping their hands into the pockets of their tuxedo trousers. Their teeth are bright, their hair is smooth and parted in the middle. And when they take the arms of the T-strap girls and guide them away from the crowd and the too bright lights, it is the clicking that makes them sway on unlit porches while the Victrola plays in the parlor. The click of dark and snapping fingers drives them to Roseland, to Bunny's, boardwalks by the sea, into places their fathers have warned them about, and their mothers shudder to think of. Both the warning and the shudder come from the snapping fingers, the clicking, and the shade. Pushed away into certain streets, restricted from others, making it possible for the inhabitants to sigh and sleep in relief. The shade stretches just there at the edge of the dream, or slips into the crevices of a chuckle. It's out there in the privet hedges that line the avenue, gliding through rooms as though it's tidying this and straightening that, it bunches on the curbstone, wrists crossed, and hides its smile under a wide brim hat. Shade, protective, available, or sometimes not. Sometimes it seems to lurk rather than hover kindly. And its stretch is not a yawn, but an increase, to be beaten back with a stick before it clicks or taps or snaps its fingers. I started out believing that life was made just so the world would have some way to think about itself, but that it had gone awry with humans because flesh, pinioned by misery, hangs on to it with pleasure, hangs on to wells with a boy's golden hair, would just as soon inhale sweet fire caused by a burning girl as hold a maybe yes, maybe no hand. I don't believe that anymore. Something is missing here. Something rogue, something else you have to figure in before you can figure it out. It's nice when grown people whisper to each other under the covers. Their ecstasy is more leaf sigh than bray, and the body is the vehicle, not the point. They reach, grown people, for something beyond, way beyond, and way, way down underneath tissue. They're remembering while they whisper the carnival dolls they won and the Baltimore boats they never sailed on. The pears they let hang on a limb, because if they plucked them, they would be gone from there. And who else would see that ripeness if they took it away for themselves? How could anybody passing by see them and imagine for themselves what the flavor would be like? Breathing and murmuring under covers both of them have washed and hung out on the line. In a bed they chose together and kept together. Never mind, one leg was propped on a 1916 dictionary, and the mattress curved like a preacher's palm, asking for witnesses in his namesake, enclosed them each and every night, and muffled their whispering, old-time love. They're under the covers because they don't have to look at themselves anymore. There is no stud's eye, no chippy glance to undo them. They are inward toward the other, bound and joined by carnival dolls and the steamers that sailed from ports they never saw. That is what is beneath their undercover whispers. But there is another part, not so secret. The part that touches fingers when one passes the cup and saucer to the other. The part that closes her neckline, snap, while waiting for the trolley, and brushes lint from his blue serge suit when they come out of the movie house and into the sunlight. I envy them, their public love. I myself have only known it in secret, shared it in secret, and longed to show it. To be able to say out loud what they have no need to say at all, that I have loved only you, surrendered my whole self, reckless to you and nobody else, that I want you to love me back and show it to me, that I love the way you hold me, how close you let me be to you. I like your fingers on and on, lifting, turning, and I've watched your face for a long time now and missed your eyes when you went away from me, talking to you and hearing you answer, that's the kick. But I can't say that out loud. I can't tell anyone that I've been waiting for this all my life, and that being chosen to wait is the reason I can. If I were able, I'd say it. Say, make me, remake me. You're free to do it, and I'm free to let you. Because look where your hands are now. Thank you.
We're going to take a break right now, about 15 minutes, and when we come back, it's your turn to ask questions of Toni Morrison and Frank McCourt. Thank you.
Good evening. First, I would like to thank you very much for the great questions that you've handed in. It's really going to make for a wonderful second half of the evening. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the hundreds of Connecticut Forum volunteers, however, I would like to ask for your assistance in expressing our appreciation and gratitude to two very special people, Richard and Doris Sugarman. First, let me ask Doris to step out here for 1 minute, and she didn't know this was coming. I promise you. Doris and Richard have brought her or his distinct talents to this organization over the years. You've seen Doris at this microphone for many of these programs throughout these 9 years. What you have not seen is how Doris, week in, week out, has focused her skills and many talents on managing the hundreds of volunteers of the Connecticut Forum, on raising over the past 9 years literally millions of dollars to support the Forum, on creating and maintaining an infrastructure for the Connecticut Youth Forum, which over the years has touched over 1,000 teenagers throughout central Connecticut. In very tangible terms, let me put it in perspective for you. Doris is not only responsible for the day-to-day operations of the Forum staff, but she leads, on a hands-on basis, the production of not only one program like this evening's program, but she does it 4 times a year within 8 months. As if that's not enough, what she also does, and what many of you may not be aware, is before each program, there is a sit-down dinner for the sponsors and their guests for more than 300 people, together with its own program. Doris does these programs, program to program and year to year. And if we judge these things on the basis of attendance, particularly tonight, when it's sold out, we would all have to say she does them quite successfully. So please, help the directors and me to recognize Doris and express your gratitude and appreciation by putting your hands together. Thank you. I have 1 minute left. I'd like to ask Richard Sugarman to step out. You certainly all know Richard. He's the only person I know who can get away with saying y'all with a northern accent. In any event, he's also the other part of this dynamic duo that has contributed so much in making the Connecticut Forum what it is. Recently, Richard was given the Hartford Current Tapestry Award. The Tapestry Award was created to celebrate individuals and organizations that emulate the cause of diversity. The winner of the award must be a person who values the differences in people, and he or she must excel in initiating and promoting efforts to encourage diversity in schools, colleges, universities, and other various parts of our lives. This individual also must have developed and implemented specific programs that bring together residents from throughout the region, and has collaborated on projects that result in building common ground for people from all walks of life. In giving the Tapestry Award this year to Richard, the judges said, and I quote, "For the work he does at the Connecticut Forum, the Youth Forum, the Hartford Public Schools, and the countless other organizations in which he is involved, Richard Sugarman fills these criteria perfectly." Congratulations, Richard. I now want to thank you. I want to thank you all for renewing your subscriptions for this coming year, and I want to thank those of you who this evening signed up for your subscriptions for the coming year. As was suggested earlier, your name has been put into this box. The winner, whose name will be drawn, will be invited to come backstage immediately after the show, meet, and have his or her picture taken with tonight's guests. So Doris, would you draw the name? And while she's drawing the name, I would like the winner immediately after the show to go to the stage door to the left here, and you'll be escorted backstage. Who's the winner?
The winner is Ed Lewis.
Ed Lewis is one of the directors of the forum. I take everything back I said about Doris. Now please join us in welcoming back our guests, Juan Williams, Toni Morrison, and Frank McCourt.
Ed Lewis, was that thing fixed or what? Huh? Unbelievable.
Do another poll.
Well, now it's time for your questions. And we have a series of questions, Toni and Frank, that touch on the same subject. So I'm going to read some of them together, and then I'm going to let you respond as you choose. This one says, I would like to address the question to Toni and Frank. Question: why, whoops, my notes have become messed up. Frank, what is the most loving memory of your mother? Both authors, you come out of cultural traditions and personal experiences of dependence on mothers. How has this shaped your writing? Discuss the cultural commonality. That's from Hank Schwartz in West Hartford. And it looks to me like on the verge of Mother's Day, I guess that's about a week away, we have lots of questions about mothers. But I think you get the general idea. So who would like to start on the theme of mothers?
Theme, mothers. I think a mother should have precedence, don't you?
Absolutely. Right.
My opinion of my mother has changed over time. 4 major shifts in my relationship to her. The first was the obvious yearning and dependence of, a very small child. But I remember very early preferring my father to my mother. She was, had a lot of lip, and, she sort of filled up a lot of space. My father was the center of our lives. Everything that we did, the food had to be prepared and on the table, the washing, everything had to be done because of him. But he just seemed to me like a nicer kind of person than my mother. For a long, long time, always preferred his company to hers. On the other hand, once I grew up and began to be a mother myself, I began to understand her in an entirely different way. We became really close friends at that time when my kids were small. And that persisted for, decades until she died. So the point being, I suppose there were some major changes in her life, but there were profound changes in mine. And it was my maturity that made it possible for me to see my mother as a complex and interesting human being whose company I really liked. I mean, if I'd met her as a stranger, I would have liked her and would have wanted to be around her. But for most of my youth, I was just, desperate to get away from that kind of influence and control and manipulation, I thought, of everything we did. And of course, at this age, I would do anything to have a group of women, if not her, but like her, who were that interested in me. Or, enough to say, you put on some lipstick when you're 12 years old in Lorain, Ohio, 5 adults would be out in the street wiping it off your face before you got home. And when you got home, your mother knew you had it on, and she would, be out. So it was that kind of nosy, picky community that I was running away from when I went away to school. And it's precisely that nosy, picky, I know what you're doing community that I would wish I had right now. Somebody who knew what was going on, who cared about it, instead of what we have, or at least I have. I don't know if this is true of many communities, which are very sweet, very polite people who don't meddle. I'd like a little meddling now and then.
So did you grow into your mother? Are you your mother?
Well, no, I don't think so. I've had to do my life has been so different from hers. I've had a job and a paycheck coming in since I was 12 years old. I still have a paycheck. I have never not had a job in addition to whatever I was doing at home. That wasn't true for my mother, and she could depend on my father, whereas I was not able to once I was divorced. So there's a whole lot of differences. But I think at the same time, it just made my relationship with her, more dear, because I didn't have to relate to her as a daughter to a mother or a mother, we were just, women who laughed a lot together at that, toward the end of her life, and certainly after I grew up and in my 40s.
Frank, I'm going to repeat the questions for you, and I found the one that I had misplaced. Again, the question is, what is your most loving memory of your mother? And also, you both come out of a cultural tradition of dependence on mothers. How has this shaped your writings? And the one that I had lost reads, in the intro, your mother was described as strong. I disagree. Do you? It comes from Aaron O'Neill Baker from Andover.
No. I think I have a lot of regrets about my mother. I didn't because of the culture we grew up in, we were not encouraged to show emotion, love especially. One time, my brother Malachi was 9 at the time, was sitting at the kitchen table drawing or scribbling or something like that, and my mother was there sitting at the fire, and he said to her, "Ma'am, I love you." I don't know what got into him, I don't know why. But there was no response. And then when our friend Bridie Hannon came from next door to have their afternoon cup of tea, my mother laughed and said to Bridie, "Do you know what he just said to me?" "What?" says Bridie. "He just told me he loved me," and they both had a good laugh. And Malachi just went through the floor, and I think it was a long, long time before he ever told anybody he loved them again. But we were not, so that when I arrived in New York and I saw the way certain people were, ethnic groups, embracing each other. So, hey, baby, you know, all of this kissing and hugging. We didn't do that. We were wary. Our way of showing affection was through teasing. And that was, sometimes people would get mad and, you know, well, no, I didn't mean it. Outsiders didn't understand this was our way of connecting with the other person. Oh, you don't look so good today, Juan. Were you out last night? You know, that's a form of thing. But as far as my mother was concerned, she, and this is again one of my great regrets, she had great promise, like most people, but she was wasted in that society. There was the heavy hand of the Catholic Church. There was the poverty, no opportunity for women like my mother to go to school. So she was out of school in the 4th grade, so there was nothing for her to do but come to New York and, again, get a job scrubbing floors. But she had another life. I knew she had another life, that she loved to sing, she had a great head for poetry, and she could be witty. When she died then, in 1981, I started thinking about it because I couldn't write Angela's Ashes while she was alive. She would have been ashamed. The shame was tremendous because you're ashamed of everything. You're ashamed of the way you look. You're ashamed of your clothes. You're ashamed of your house. You're ashamed of everything. So I couldn't write it till she was dead. And then I began to think about her more and more and more, and she becomes heroic. That she hung out, dogged is it maybe a better. She's dogged. She was encouraged by many people to put us in an orphanage. Other kids in the neighborhood had gone into orphanages, and the horror stories that are coming out now about those orphanages are causing a lot of scandal and honor. But she didn't put us in. We hung on, and eventually I left to come to America, and everybody. But she kept us there, and there were days that she had to go out and beg, and that's the low point. There were moments when I think 3 times my father sent money from England, and it was a big celebration. It wasn't much money. It was about £3 or £4. And she would go out there and she'd get tea and bread and butter, and she'd put on the kettle and make the tea, and we'd sit around that night and Saturday night, and she would sing. And these are particular moments in my life because if she'd married the right man, if she'd met the right man, she would have been a happy woman, raising kids and keeping a house. So I had those moments, they're not very important. There's moments sitting around the fire when she had a bit of money. They were joyful moments, and they revealed a lot about her, the kind of life that she could have had. And so I live in a state of regret that I didn't know her better. But now I think more and more about her. So if I write about her, maybe that's a kind of a memorial.
Let's shift gears a little bit. This one's for both authors, and it says, what are you teaching? And what about writing can be taught? What about writing can't be taught? Toni?
Well, I have been in something called creative writing programs for a long time now, and I've done it at several universities. I was a little wary about it at first because I didn't think I could do it, and it wasn't that I couldn't do it. I didn't think it could be done. And it seemed almost to me at the time a way in which writers earn money to keep them out of the poorhouse or not dependent on grants and, friendships and so on, by teaching something called creative writing. And at that time, there wasn't a writer in the world that I knew who had ever taken a course in creative writing, including myself. Now, of course, there are writers who have gone through creative writing programs all over the nation. So, but I went in sort of feeling strong because I had, since I began to teach in university when I was 26 years old, 25 years old. So I'd been teaching for years and years and years before I was ever a writer. So I understood methods of correcting papers, really. But by the time I was a writer and got these jobs offered, I had also published and worked as an editor. And I still do that. I edit when I'm in a creative writing class. Line edit, and I make them write it over. The way I would do any novice or author who needed that kind of help. The big things, truth, beauty, etc., I don't even attempt, but I can help. I'm really very good at finding ways to help writers do what they want to do best, what their style is. So that I feel comfortable about. But I've never felt comfortable doing that only, and I've always taught literature classes one way or another, in addition to creative writing.
And very quickly, before we move on, is there a way that you go about writing in your own life? Do you write at a certain time of day? Is there a rhythm to how much you write every day? Are there times when you don't write?
There's some general outlines. Each person has to find his or her formula, and what kind of space do you like when you write? I always ask my students, if you could have the best place to write, what would it look like? Or is it night? Is it day? Is it early in the morning? What do you got, sandwiches? You got a dog? What? And but they figure it out because they know what's comfortable to them. So you have to find out when is your best time for thinking up things. For me, it's very, very early in the morning. Very early, and I really like to be up before there is light, so that I am there before that. And I am so smart, I have to tell you, at that hour. You would not believe it. I mean, it's just, nobody's calling me, nobody's there, there's no distraction. And if I start writing, and when I say I get up early, I mean I get up early. I get up at 4:30, 4:45. So by the time it's 10 o'clock and other people are stirring, I've had all that time to myself, and I have been really good. Now, after lunch, this is why I'm such a lousy dinner companion. I can't think up a thing. My head just begins to, collapse, because I've passed my arc. The other thing that's still hanging on, and many writers have changed their habits, I still write words with number 2 pencil on yellow pads. And it works for me because I don't like the act of writing, of forming letters. So I tend to be more careful, and I like seeing it, cutting it, changing it, moving arrows and so on. And I do a lot of that. And then I go to the screen, type it up, and then I print it out, and then I start marking it up again. So that goes on back and forth and back and forth. I don't trust the print because it looks like it has a certain amount of authority that it may not have. The writing, I like the freedom of cutting and slashing and moving and so on. But at some point you have to kind of see it formulated. I can tell, I think, when students are accustomed to composing on the computer. It's entirely different writing from writing that's handwritten. Really, and not as good. It's, it's struts a little bit, like it's, you just want to slash it, so. But more and more people do compose on computers now, and not the way that I do it.
Frank, let me repeat the question. What are you teaching, and what about writing can be taught or not taught?
Well, when I went to Stuyvesant High School, they gave me creative writing classes to teach, and they just threw me into the classroom. And I suppose there are courses you can take on how to teach creative writing. I don't know. I never had. So you go in there and you're defining things for yourself, and there has to be procedure. First of all, you have to keep the kids in their seats because otherwise the principal will be upset, and so that's your main. And then to get them to write, and then you go back to the old tried and true formula: write what you know. Then they, we don't have nothing to write about. And in many cases, they were right. Because there were middle class and upper middle class kids from the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So you try to get, but what I discovered then was the family material. Parents and grandparents, a lot of Jewish kids had parents and grandparents who had survived the camps, and Chinese kids whose parents were working in sweatshops or kitchens in Chinatown. And the Jewish kids would open up. This is another cultural thing. They started writing, or if they could get their grandmothers and grandfathers to talk, and often they could. But they were more confessional. The Chinese kids, no. One of the kids said to me, he was a 14-year-old, he told me his mother was working in a sweatshop. I said, Jesus, he said, because the kids were complaining in the class, that's what it was. And he stopped me in the hallway, and he said, I came to this country when I was 10, and I didn't know any English. I'm 14 now, and I got into Stuyvesant High School, which is not an easy school to get into. He said, I don't know why these kids are complaining. And he told me about his mother, and I said, why don't you write about your mother? He wouldn't. He said, she'd be ashamed. The shame, again, that we had back in Limerick. So I was seizing whatever I could, and as far as structure is, I wasn't concerned with that at all. This was a free-for-all, discovering material, discovering your style. I would say the only way to do it is to do it. It's like being an athlete. You have to do it every day. You discover your style, you discover your material, you discover your style, hope that they go together, and just tell your story. When in doubt, once upon a time is good enough.
All right. Let me ask you guys to respond more quickly so we can get through more of these questions.
Talk faster.
Talk faster.
Less
All right.
and faster.
There we go. How do you survive whole in a world where we're all victims of something? It's to both of you.
How do you survive whole? I can't do this quickly, Juan.
Okay.
How can you survive whole and where we're victims of something? That's a nice, big, fat, Eastern, Western philosophical question about how do you get through. Sometimes you don't survive whole, you just survive in part. But the grandeur of life is that attempt. It's not about that solution. It is about, being as fearless as one can and behaving as beautifully as one can under completely impossible circumstances. It's that makes it elegant. Good is just more interesting, more complex, more demanding. Evil is silly. It may be horrible, but at the same time, it's not a compelling idea. It's predictable. It needs a tuxedo. It needs a headline. It needs blood. It needs fingernails. It needs all that costume in order to get anybody's attention. But the opposite, which is survival, blossoming, endurance, those things are just more compelling intellectually, if not spiritually, and they certainly are spiritually. This is more fascinating job. We are already born. We are going to die. So you have to do something interesting that you respect in between.
That was wild. I like it.
That's it.
Frank, you want me to repeat it?
As I grow older, I'm more wary all the time of isms and dogmas and firm beliefs. People who belong to that party and that party and that religion. I don't know how anybody knows anything. How do they arrive at all of this? Do they really think it out for themselves? Those who are Jewish, do they really figure it out? Those who are Catholic? Those who are Democrat? I don't know why anybody is a Democrat or Republican. I can't figure out the figuring out. It has liberated me now, because I used to be a Catholic and an Irishman. And now I'm nothing. I'm just a storyteller. Thank God and his blessed mother.
Mary Ann Donovan of Abington Court wants to know, Frank, what's the one question you wish people would ask, and please answer it?
I can't say it. My wife is here. I think one question that they never ask me is, am I a good cook? And I make the best mashed potatoes in the world. And three brothers who would argue with that, but I do make the best mashed potatoes in the world. And I wish I could have a big party.
A big party?
Mashed potatoes.
Mashed potatoes for everybody?
Because I think Toni and I were just talking briefly about the questions you're asked as you go on these tours, and you're asked everything. So there's hardly a question that hasn't been asked. But that's the one.
The cook.
Add it to the list.
All right.
I know it's not much of an answer.
Well, what?
I know it's not much. I know.
What's the one that you can't tell us because your wife's here? Like, are you a good lover or something?
Probably something like that.
Something like that. All right.
Shall I bring her up?
Bring her up? No, no. Please, my goodness. No testimonials. That gets into the category of bragging, Frank.
But you're not taking those potatoes seriously.
You think I should? Potatoes?
Listen, everybody thinks he or she can make potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not true. You have to select, right, the potatoes. You have to know how to cook. You have to know how to season them. You have to know how to beat them. This is not simple. Just because they're white and soft, you think you've done it. You haven't. This man knows that those simple things are very hard to do. Soup and mashed potatoes and a loaf of bread.
Oh, yeah.
If you can surpass yourself in those areas, then you're a cook.
And the potato.
And the potatoes. Potatoes, soup, and bread.
It isn't generally known that the potato is a powerful aphrodisiac. That's why the population of Ireland. It's true. Around the time of the arrival of Sir Walter Raleigh brought the potato over and gave it and showed it to Queen Elizabeth, and she thought it was a disgusting looking thing. So she said, "Take it over to Ireland." He took it to his estate, and the population, which Cromwell had decimated, then once they started eating the potato, it went from about 500,000 to 8.5 million.
Wow.
And then there was the potato famine, and that's why I'm here tonight.
Toni, we have a question here that really is from a whole class, and I think it lends itself to a quick answer. It says, in your novel Beloved, can you explain the significance of 124? My students have a theory that if you subtract the year of the Emancipation Proclamation from the copy date of Beloved, it is 124.
See? I have read several articles about what the 124 means, the absence of 3, blah, 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 blah. It maybe it's all there. Myself, see, my address is 224. And I wanted to begin the book with an address. And so I just played around a little bit with my own. I happened to like the sound of 124, but it was more important to have a slave woman with an address, which was a big deal because, first of all, they didn't have houses they owned, they didn't, So she finally became manumitted or was freed, and she not only had a house, it had an address. And it was almost like, it was a dream come true to begin the book with the kind of defiance of having this slave woman in a house with an address. And the randomness of the choice really was random, but I don't have any problems with people finding other, much more intricate reasons for things like addresses.
Frank, here's one. It comes from I think it's Mark Trahan, and it says, "What's the title of the book that you're afraid to write?"
That's right. I'm writing it.
You're writing it.
Yeah. It has two titles. But the one I'm leaning towards, there was something, a phrase, a saying my mother used to have in Ireland, people who complain but do nothing about it. Whining. It's like a donkey sitting on a thistle. A thistle is a very sharp,
Yeah.
it's the emblem of Scotland. It's very spiky. It's very spiky, and a donkey would sit on a thistle, and if he's a lazy donkey, he'll just sit and bray because these things are sticking in his rump. And my mother used to say, he's like a donkey on a thistle, whining. So I think that's the. I was going to say the putative title, but geez, they'd say he went to college. It's the working title.
Tony?
Yes, I have, well, you mean the title, or am I afraid to write? No one's going to ask me, am I
Well,
scared? The book I'm afraid to write? Or maybe there is a book I'm afraid to write, which is not a novel. Maybe it's a memoir.
Uh-huh.
I'm scared about that, and I'm not writing it, and it has no title.
All right, this one goes for all three. It says, what's been the proudest moment so far in your life? Why don't we start with Frank? Comes from Joanna Barker in West Hartford, Hall High School.
The proudest moment? God, that's very hard. I don't know what the proudest moment. I think the proudest moment was the day that I put the last word in Angela's Ashes. Finish. I couldn't. And it's one word. It's a chapter with one word. Tis. A woman wrote to me recently. She wanted her money back. She said that chapter was missing. But I think because this is what I wanted to do for years and years and years. And I would look around the world. I'd look at the Toni Morrisons and so on, and all these people were writing, and I was teaching away. So when I finished, the day that I finished that, my wife Ellen and I had a bottle of champagne, and I think she thought I hadn't finished the chapter too. But that I felt. I hate to use the word redeemed. It's overused. I felt redeemed. Now I've written this book, and now I can die. But I have no intention.
You hang in there, brother. Tony?
I think there are probably some things that are publicly memorable for me, that are singular, triumphant, and dear. One was the ceremony in Stockholm when I won the Nobel Prize that year. And there have been other loving things. But as a person, at the risk of being very mundane, as a person, what worked when I felt most delighted with myself, most successful, having done a hard, difficult thing and it came out beautifully. It was when each time that I had a child. That was the best of all things that ever happened to me. And I had the sensation, although it's biologically impossible, I did that. That was the most satisfying thing I had ever done, and it made me proudest of myself. Since that time, there have been, sort of public accolades, and the only other thing that pleases me near giving birth, is the same thing that Frank was alluding to, is the satisfaction of completing that work. When that's done, it is bliss, I think, is the only word for it.
Well, I'm not sure how I would answer this. I can't have a baby in the way you can have a baby.
No, you can't.
No, I can't. So I can't touch
It's
it.
forbidden to you.
But I would say, next year, my son graduates from McAllister College, And for some reason, in my imagination, I think of myself as a very proud dad crying when that boy graduates from college. Because it's, giving birth is one thing, but
That's another kind of
the
birth.
growing up and watching and the struggling and, the reactions that sons have against fathers, right? Fathers are never cool or right, And for me, this is going to be a very emotional moment, and I can anticipate this in a way as unalloyed pride.
You're right.
I can anticipate that. I would also say, with great humility in the presence of you two, that writing is a tremendous intellectual exercise. And that if I'm, as a journalist, when I feel like I have got it right, that I have told the story with you talked about the characters, you check with the characters, is this right? But when I write it, and I feel that there are people out there who aren't going to like it, people out there who may be offended by the way history is told, but nonetheless would have to say, well, you know what, that's what happened. Realizing that I am constantly under that kind of scrutiny, and yet feeling that I've got it right brings me great joy. So that it's not necessarily having the book published, as with the biography of Justice Marshall, but it's now years later when people who were initially antagonized come up to me and say, that's the best book I've ever read about a Supreme Court justice, and then I feel very proud.
Indeed.
Yeah, okay, so that was the answer to that. We have just a few seconds left, and I wanted to ask the two of you, this question is so simple, maybe you like it, maybe you won't, but it's obviously prime material for a quick answer. Your favorite author, Frank McCourt.
Rabelais,
And a quick answer, why?
because he's rowdy, he's brazen, he's scholarly, and he's obscene, and fine at the same time.
Toni Morrison.
Gabriel Marquez. Because he's perfect.
Perfect.
Well, let's put it this way. When Marquez makes a mistake, they are better than everybody else's successes.
We are out of time, but this has been a joy, and I hope that you have enjoyed it. Thank you. It has been a pleasure for me to be in the company of these two literary giants. Frank McCourt, thank you. Toni Morrison, what a pleasure. And thank you for being such a great audience. Those were wonderful questions.